Hello and welcome to Discover Dorico in October 2024. Today's session is going to be about orchestral percussion and drum kit notation. We'll look at various methods of note input, the visual side of the notation and the audible side for playback, and how the techniques are linked via setup mode and percussion maps. My colleagues will be monitoring the live chat if you have any questions as we go along, so please put them in there. I've added some links in the description below this video to some resources, and there's a previous session that we've done on some drum kit notation, so I'll remind you about those as we go through the session as well. The session will always be available on this same URL link. You can pause, rewind, or come back and catch up at any time. After the session, I'll add chapter links so you can skip to specific sections, and if they aren't there yet, then you're probably watching live, so come back later. Don't forget, on YouTube you can click on the cog for settings such as a playback speed and the HDR resolution. And for playback speed you can slow me down or speed me up, and you can also use the shortcut K to pause, J to go back for a few seconds, and L to skip forward. Also, please subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified of other videos and live streams that we do. I'll be doing another one this month as well. So let's get started. I've got the chat open over here as well so that I can also keep an eye on things. We're going to start, I think, by looking today at some orchestral percussion and various options and layout things you might want, and various types of labels and that kind of thing. And then we'll move into the drum kit notation. So if drum kit notation is your thing, then you can pop to the bar now. I'll just have a Coke, please, I'm driving. And come back in a bit. And if it's the orchestral percussion you need, actually there are some useful bits in both of sides of that, so actually stay with us for the whole thing and pick up some tips along the way. And hi to all the people in the chat who are saying hello, so nice to see you. So what we'll do is, as usual, I'll stick down here in the corner, and we'll work through from the beginning. I'm going to start with an empty template again, so if you do want to follow along, then you can probably follow along with lots of the things we're doing. And I'll turn on the keystrokes here so that if I do a keyboard shortcut, it might pop up only briefly. Let me know if they need to be longer for future sessions, but we'll go from there. And you can follow along. I'll also try and tell you if I'm pressing shortcuts and keyboard shortcuts for things as we go. So going to start from the hub here. I'm not going to bother filling any of the details. I'm just going to leave it on the defaults. Your defaults may be slightly different. You might have a different paper size, for example, or rastral size. I'll leave these as the defaults for now. I don't have multiple flows ticked. Maybe we'll need them. Maybe we won't. So I'm just going to tick Create Project. And then to start off with, we're going to need to add some players as usual. Most of the time, I think these are all going to be single players that you're going to be adding, but you won't necessarily always add them here. I had a couple of examples that people had mentioned on the forum or on Facebook recently of some of the combinations and things that they might want. So you're probably going to want some extra things. There are other things here, other instruments, but hopefully this will give you an idea of some of the instruments and how we can combine things. So I'm going to start with just the add single player. I'm going to say, well, if you wanted just a timpani, for example, you can just start typing that, and there's a couple of options: default and no key signature, depending on the I guess the age, not of the timpani player, of the music. And just press add, and that will give you, so for some instruments that's all going to be the same as usual. I'm going to press my shortcut for hiding the signposts. If you want to hide the signposts for things like the key signatures, because we're not going to really use those today, then it's in View Signposts. But like I said, I've set a little key command, a little shortcut for those. Now, for other players, we'll add a few more. So we'll add them in the same way to start off with. So the button at the bottom down here for the adding a single player we'll be using. But actually, I'm also going to just press Shift P, because that will give me the single player. And let's start off with something like a crash cymbal. You've got a couple of options: crash cymbal high and low. Ribbon crasher was in there. I'm not actually planning to talk about too much today about kind of the US marching style. there is a template available from Eric Cruz, so if you need that, drop me an email, discoverdorico@steinberg.de, and I'll put you in touch with Eric about a template for the marching US style. Anyway, so crash cymbal. If I add some other instruments, let's do it this way to start off with, so because I'm sure you have probably started this way at some point. So I'll have a suspended cymbal as well. Let's add a tam-tam. So I'm pressing Shift P to add a new player each time, and it's adding those instruments for me. And each one of the ones I'm adding here is also appearing on the score. I bet somebody's already thinking, that's not how I want them to display. That's fine. We're going to cover all sorts of options for how we can make these display, so don't worry. So when we've added 3 players, we've got 3 on here, and at the moment we have 3 layouts over here. Now, one of the things you might want to do, well, actually, let's just add a few more instruments as well. So let's add a triangle and a snare drum, Shift P, bass drum. Don't just type bass, or you'll probably get a bass singer or a bass instrument of some other sort. So now I have these instruments, and they all have single lines. I know that's not necessarily how you want them, but they all have single lines to start off with, adding them all in the same way. Of course, if you're adding things like mallet percussion, so if you're adding things like glockenspiel, Shift P, xylophone, and let's say chimes, then they're going to be all added in here as well. These, of course, are pitched instruments, so they're going to get 5-line staff by default, and these at the moment are all single line, and we'll look at some other options for those. They're adding in orchestral order, so it says down here orchestral. And there's a little sort option here as well that you can use to sort them if you want to sort them into a different order and you don't want them to be automatically sorted, then you can do that. And you can sort them just by dragging these here. So if you wanted to drag various people together, then you can just do this, and you can drag, for example, snare and bass and triangle together like that. And that will sort the order on the page. So that's the real simple basics. We've got a one-to-one mapping of the players over here versus the layouts over here. So every instrument has a layout. They're all available in the drop down here. All of these are just listing as a single line staff here. The pitched instruments are listing as a 5-line staff. The timpani at the top. So that's kind of your very basic kind of setup for all of those, but there are various things that we can do to combine about these, and I think some of the questions that we've got possibly aren't going to be about percussion today, so maybe that's for a future session. So let's say we want to combine some of these. So the first way we combine them is, for all of these are players, of course, and they all have instruments. So when you click on this little arrow at the side, then it shows me the player name at the top and then the instrument underneath. So I have suspended cymbal, and then if I open this one, we've got crash cymbal, and this one is tam-tam. So I can take the instrument, and instead of dragging the whole player, as I was doing here when I was sorting the order, I can just grab the instruments inside it and drop that instead for this player. So now I can drag the crash cymbal and the tam-tam to the suspended cymbal player, and now you see that we've got less players showing here, or less instruments actually showing here. And also now we have one player, which is suspended cymbal, crash cymbal and tam-tam, and the label's fallen off because it's so big. Over here on the right hand side for the layouts, we also have now a combined part here for those. So we've just got one player who's playing more than one instrument now. Now you can do this before or after you've added the music. So let me just undo for a second. So Control Z, put it back as it was, just to say if we were in write mode here and I added some some notes. So I'm just you can double click on the staff and either press Y for adding a default note. I can use the arrow keys, or I can do the same. Double click over here. I can also press enter to turn the current line on and off, of course, when something is selected. And Y, it just enters a default note. And it's doing that also with the default note head that's set for that instrument. So we'll also need to look at some of those options as well in a second. So I'm adding notes that way. There are a number of different ways you can do it. Actually, because this is a single line instrument for any of these, you can press any letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and it will enter those pitches because it's all going to put them on the same line. So I was using Y because that's the default it's the default note button, and it was a bit close to the middle of the keyboard, but you can actually use any of the letters A to G. And we'll also look in a little while how you can use a MIDI keyboard to do the note input as well. The point is, we've got some notes, and even when we have some notes, if we drag the crash cymbal up here again to combine these players and the tam-tam, then what Dorico will do is this, and we're going to look at how these labels will work and which labels we want at various times. But it's automatically combining all of these players onto one staff, and it's automatically changing the labels and also, of course, the short label here. So we've started off with a suspended cymbal here, and then it's gone to tam-tam. So that might be what you want. What it has also done, of course, is in the parts, we now have this combined part with a very big name that we probably want to change, and it's got various labels on it here for what's going on. I would say this is probably too many labels in this particular case because they're changing quite quickly, so also we can change those. So one of the ways you can do that is if you go to the library menu and layout options. Because this is a per layout option for what the labeling is going to be, then you want to be in layout options. And for your players, for instrument changes, you can allow instrument changes or not. And you can also decide what's going to happen here, and if you need to hide any of the warnings when they're a bit too close. But the top option here is also the allow instrument changes or not. So if you want to allow instrument changes, you tick that box, and that's ticked by default. But if I just show you, if I untick it and press apply, then what you'd actually get here is 3 individual staves. And if you were doing this, then you might also want to go to the staves and systems and turn on the full and abbreviated labels maybe for these systems. Depends on the look you're going for and everything else, how clearly labelled it is. Maybe you're just going to label them above the staff instead. But you have these options for whether or not you want to allow instrument changes. So if I apply that, then Dorico is doing the instrument changes automatically for you. Of course, this is on a per layout basis, so in the full score, allow instrument changes is also on. So if I switch back to the full score here, that's why we're seeing the instrument changes here. If, for example, you wanted something different in the full score, then you can turn off the allow instrument changes, and you would get the individual instruments in the score. And if I turn them back on, then you would get the instrument changes in the score as well to conserve space, maybe in conjunction with condensing. But this isn't condensing, it's just showing you the instrument changes. Now, that's no good if you want to write for these 3 instruments, because of course to write for these instruments you need to be able to see them all. Now if I go over here and I'm trying to enter a note over here, I've only got tam-tam because that's the last note that I picked, that I wrote. So what you would want to do in this case is you want to go down to galley view. So at the bottom of the screen down here, you can go to galley view. And now you've got the 3 individual instruments. You can also do galley view at the top here, and you can choose page view and galley view from the view menu. And of course there are shortcuts for these, which is commonly what I would probably use. So you can switch between page view and galley view with those shortcuts. So now in galley view, I've just got one long continuous stream of music that I can write for. Be scroll view in Finale, panorama in Sibelius. And now I can write for the notes wherever I want them. So this is more your kind of composer view of here's all of the instruments and the percussion and how I want to put those together, what I want them to look like, sound like, and anything else, and where I want the notes to be. And Dorico will then put the instrument changes in for me as I need them. I'm in the way of the icons in the lower left. Oh, I'm sorry, Doug. I wasn't I? Yes. So if I use any of the buttons in the lower left, I'm in the way. Hopefully I'll get out of the way in a bit. So yes, you mean these ones? Yes. I don't think we've used them yet, but we might for the rhythm grid in a bit. So these and these labels here, these ghost labels, are showing me what's going on, as well as the labels at the beginning. Now, it might be that you don't want this player to be called suspended cymbal, crash cymbal, and tam-tam, and the part. I think that was probably the other most obvious problem, was the part label up here. So there was that problem. There's also the fact that the labels at the beginning says suspended cymbal, because that's the first instrument you're using. It's the first one here, and then it's got the instrument changes in it for everything else. But maybe you don't want it to say suspended cymbal, you want it to say percussion here. Maybe you want it to say percussion in the layout over here, that's displayed on the layout at the top up here. So let's change some of these. So over here in setup mode, we have the player and they have various instruments. So to start off with, what you'd want to do is right click on the player and then you can rename the player. I know some people just double click up here and change it here, but if you do that, you're not changing both names because there is both a full name and a short name. So really, you want to use the rename player option. So this could be, for example, percussion 1. So we'll call it perc.1. Press OK. So now we have a player called percussion 1 who has a number of instruments, and over here it's changed the layout name to say percussion 1. So when we go to this drop down, it now says percussion 1 and this is percussion 1. So this may change whether or not you want the labels at the beginning of the staff. Of course, you can do that in the layout options, but they are being labelled here. Maybe you'd also want to turn some of these extra labels off, as we said earlier. Now, so that's some of it, but it hasn't changed this one here in the score. So again, what you do is go to the layout options again, Command-Shift-L or Control-Shift-L, and in here, for the staves and systems, when you normally set the full and abbreviated labels for the instruments, so the full label on the first system, the abbreviated label for the subsequent systems, on the right-hand side over here, you can also show the player name instead of the instrument name. So for percussion 1, and you can choose all systems or only the first system, maybe you want percussion 1 to start off with, and then you want the abbreviated label on all of the other systems, you can choose that option. But I'm just going to say percussion 1 for all systems, press apply, and this is of course for the full score only. So now it says percussion 1 here, it says perc 1 over here because I changed both labels, and I've got the instruments labelled accordingly as to who's playing and what they're playing and when. And we will look at playback things as well. There's a couple of questions about playback and those kind of things. So that's one of the things to initially for labels is that you can have percussion 1. So in the example I was given, the person said they had percussion 1 and percussion 2. So this one, they would have combined this way. Now, you don't have to combine them later. So when you've first pressed Shift-P and added your players, you can see they always have a little plus here. So if you want to add new players, if you want to add new instruments to the player, you can just press that little plus, and the shortcut at this point is Shift-I to add another instrument to this selected player. But I'm combining this one. I'm going to do the same. I'm going to rename him. I'm going to say percussion 2. This would be perc.2. And again, in the layout options, then I could say perc 2 also wants to use their labels here. So now the parts are done, these labels are done, the labels on subsequent pages are done, and they will change. But when you're writing for these instruments, you can just go to Galley View, and although they all say percussion 1, 2, as soon as you're past bar 1, then you can see now all of the labels here, and they're all a bit shorter as well because it only says percussion 1. So the ghost labels are there to tell you which instrument is which. So that's one way you can put things together. You can also do this for other players. So we had these players here for the glockenspiel, xylophone and chimes. So we'll add that one to there, we'll add that one to there. Like I said, you can do this as you were setting the project up. We'll say that this is the mallets player. What's the short? I don't know what that is. And maybe let's have that. That'll do. So we've got a long name and a short name for that. Again, now that might just be the label that we're using here for our own sake for the mallets, but maybe you still want these to be, I don't know, 3 separate instruments, so they can all be different if you need them to be. So this one, let's say we'll leave it different, but if not, change it in the library menu. In the layout options. So library menu, layout options, if you want to change that. So different ways of labeling and combining these instruments, and you can combine and uncombine. Is that the right word? At any time. So if you then find you write a part which is too complicated for one mallets player to play, then you can just drag that to another empty-handed player. You can delete these if you don't need them. Now I've got some extra ones, so I'll delete them, player and the part layouts that I don't need over here. If you need an extra player at some point, you can just press the little plus icon here for the single player. You can press Shift P. It will add an empty-handed player. It will ask you which instruments you want. You can just press Escape and get rid of that one. And then you can drag and drop the any of these instruments to the empty-handed player. But if I remove those for now from this project, then I've got this setup. So if this is the kind of setup you would commonly want, probably without the notes in it, then you only need to do this once, because then you can go to File and you can go to Save as Project Template, and you can save yourself a template with the setup and the labeling and everything exactly as you wanted it. So if Dorico's defaults, as in most cases, if Dorico's defaults weren't exactly what you wanted, you can change them once, save those as a default, or save them as a template in this case, and then use that project in the future with the instruments. And now you've got these percussion instruments, for example, you can still easily add and remove instruments from each player if you need to change those, if you're with what you're doing. I'm in the way. I'm pointing to the add player icons. I'm sorry, Doug. Yes, I understand what you mean. I'm in the way when I'm talking about these player icons down here. So if we've been talking about these player icons, it's because I commonly don't use them, and I just use Shift P to add a new player, and I use Shift I to add a new instrument, or use this button here. But yes, sorry, I was in the way for that bit. Sorry, but thanks for mentioning. I used to have a little reminder on my screen of that. I've obviously not done that. I think that's yes. So various options for those labeling. Now, yes, it might be that you want to manually label this. Maybe you need to, if you're doing this kind of label, I suppose you would need to say actually what that instrument is. So maybe you want to. You could even just do that with text if you wanted to, or anything else. These are the ones that are being added automatically, and actually some of these maybe, as I said, in the layout options, you might not want quite as many of those options if they're all playing. I suppose if they're not playing quite so, there you go, see that one's updating automatically, then that's okay, because they're not happening quite so quickly. So it'll depend on the frequency of those and how often you want them. Let me just check on that. That's okay. So that's one way of setting it up that way. Now, all of these are single line instruments, and you might not want single line instruments. It might be that actually you want a 5-line staff with these instruments displayed on a 5-line staff. So how do we go about doing that instead? So now I've noticed I'm going to be in the way. So if I add, I'm going to do this in a different way. Add a single player, or Shift P, and I've got an empty-handed player. What you can also do is you can use this button for Create an Empty Kit. So there isn't a default option in Dorico that already has suspended cymbal, crash cymbal, and tam-tam in it, in a 5-line staff, for example. But we can make that. So we can say Create Empty Kit. And this gives us a blank kit. So there are 5 lines here, 5 grey lines, which is the normal staff, and there's a couple outside it, which are the basically ledger lines, if you were to go that far. This is also where you can define a grid layout and single line instruments. So we'll look at all of the options in here, but commonly people are just using the 5-line staff option here. Now, if you were to start at the very beginning, a very good place to start, and you didn't have these instruments already here, and you wanted to add a suspended cymbal, for example, you'd click the little plus button here, and you could add a new instrument in the same way you would for anything else. It's just showing you all of the unpitched options here, and you could add a new instrument to your kit. But I already have these instruments, and it's just that I've now decided I don't want them as single-line instruments. I want them to be in a 5-line staff. So if I now go to this little button here, this is the import. So add existing instrument from a player. So I'll click that button, and here are the 2 players, percussion 1 and percussion 2, that I labelled earlier. And I can choose the suspended cymbal and the crash cymbal and the tam-tam. I can choose something from percussion 2 as well if I want to, doesn't matter. And I can put these on the staff wherever I would like them to be. So let's say we want them like this for some reason. So on our 5-line staff, the suspended cymbal will be on that line, the crash cymbal will be on that line. You can put them on spaces as well. And the tam-tam will be on a space at the bottom, just because. You can set stem direction and voice if you need to, but I'm going to leave them all the same, at least at the moment. And I can press apply. Now, there is also a grid layout here, and there is a single line instruments option. So if you need to add more space for grid, what's a grid? Find out in a minute. Or if you need to change the order when they're displayed as single line instruments, or grid for that matter, then you can, but I'm going to leave them all the same so we don't get too confused about the order of these instruments. So I'll now press close. So now this is a drum grid instead. So instead of the single line instrument I had only showing me one instrument, and let's expand this, I did have a percussion one with 3 instruments in it. I've imported them into this kit here, which is now green. So you can always tell the difference between the kits and these single line instruments here. So this green one here is showing me as a grid. Now you might not want a grid, but let's have a look at it to start off with. So now when I double click here, you see I have a little carrot line. This is a little bit more like a drum kit actually. And as I move to each of the lines, then it's auditioning that sound for me, and then I could use Y again if I wanted to input those. But because when I set them up on a 5-line staff, and the way I set them up, you can also, if you want to, use a MIDI keyboard or letter names to do that as well. So, for example, I can enter notes if I need to from a MIDI keyboard and input things that way, or I can just press Y again, so I can move around like this, and I can enter notes where I want them and press Y. Now we're not going to need any of the little labels probably in this view, and it's clearly showing me, you know, the 3 lines and that I've got for each instrument. But the other, oh actually let's leave that one in. The other way you can display this, or there's a couple of other ways you can display this, is as a 5-line staff if you need to, or as single line instruments again. So in the library menu, this is again a layout specific option, so we're going to layout options, and now in the players section, a new section has been added, which is percussion. That wasn't there until we had a percussion kit, but now it is there. There's this little extra option for percussion, which says, how do you want to display this, as a 5-line staff, a grid, or single line instruments? So single line instruments would basically be back where we were at the beginning. Let me close that. So I've got each of the individual instruments listed, even though they are still showing here as a kit. So it's expanded them out. Now sometimes that's a useful way for you to write the music to be clear, you know, about each line and what's going on there. If I go back into layout options, I use the shortcut Command-Shift-L and the percussion. Now I can go to 5-line staff. So for this same player, with the 3 options I've got for displaying how they work, I now have a percussionist again, and they have these items listed. Now, although this is a 5-line staff, if I double click here to do note input, when I press the arrows up and down, it's only moving to those 3 instruments. So I can't accidentally go to somewhere else on, enter another note, because they just don't exist. So it's not really a 5-line staff, if you like, because you can't go to all of the other options, all of the other lines and spaces. But you can enter notes for those particular instruments. Now, when you're inputting notes this way, you see if I press G, A, E, a load of these don't work. D does, of course, and F does. So it's treating this like a treble clef. And there's an option in the preferences for whether you want to treat it like a treble clef or a bass clef. So on the Mac in Dorico preferences, or on a PC it's in the edit menu in preferences. If you scroll down here, there are a couple of options also for when you're using a MIDI keyboard, and they differ for kits and for single line staves. So we're doing kits or grids at the moment, and what we're doing and we're interpreting as a treble clef. Now this is for when you're doing MIDI input from a MIDI keyboard as well, so we'll also do that, especially when we look at drum kits a bit later, because there's many more options. So there are other ways you can do note input if you don't want to be using a MIDI keyboard for this kind of style at the moment, is in the properties panel down here. So I've clicked on this little arrow at the bottom, and the shortcut for it is Command 8 to open and close that little panel. And over here we have our key editor, and we also have drum pads. So the drum pads now are showing me the 3 items that I've got available. So 1 pad for each. They're resizable, they're sortable and everything else, but you can, if you want to, use them for note input. So over here you can use these if you so wished, and maybe on a MIDI keyboard, on an iPad, maybe that would be a good way of doing things. It's also a very clear visual way of doing things, but shortcut wise, I would probably just use this caret and use something like the letter Y to enter a note as I'm on the right instrument. So there's also the key editor, which is showing me all of the individual notes. So as I choose the note here, it's showing me in the key editor. And if I choose the note here, then it's also showing in the key editor, so they're updating. So any note I have here, if I make this longer, it's also going to make the note longer here, or shorter. And the same if I make the note longer or shorter up here. So they're always mirroring each other. But it's also showing me all three instruments here. So you can enter notes down here as well if you want to. So let's say you're working along here in bar 11. You can either use the drum stick, and you can draw in notes here. And you see, as I click and drag on those, it enters individual notes according to the rhythm grid. Now the rhythm grid, now that I'm not in the way, is down here. So if you wanted to enter 16th notes instead, then you can change it down here. But that one isn't going to change your rhythm grid in here. You want to use this one. So we have rhythm grids differently for the notation up here and the drums, and this can be really useful just when you're entering drums and you want to do things down here if you need to change things. Now, I think the way you're probably going to use this though, especially for orchestral and especially for cymbals, is that you're probably going to use the pencil tool instead, which is why I've just switched this one. Because if I now click and drag here, then it's going to enter one long note, whereas with the drumstick it was entering lots and lots of notes. So I think that's probably, for orchestral, a more likely way to do things. And of course, you've got the arrow for editing things later as well. There are various different ways, depending on how you want to input things. I think I probably use the staff and shortcuts, often just Y. So move the caret to where you want it to be, and the rhythm grid set to how you want it to be, and then use Y to input the notes. But you can use a QWERTY keyboard, you can use a MIDI keyboard, and we'll look into some of those again when we look at drum kits in a second, and the differences why you might want to use those in different ways. Other than that, the note input is very similar, so you can still use the pitch before duration if you want to. You've still got your note values here if you want to use them that way, but to actually put the note in, Y is the obvious key to go for. It's in the middle of the keyboard. Why is it the default note put note? Well, because it is. Let me just check I haven't skipped over anything. That bit's, yeah. So in this particular case that I was given from somebody, what they actually wanted was 2 5-line staves with everything in it. So I'm going to do the same again. So just quickly add an empty-handed player with an empty kit. And this time I'm going to put percussion 2. See, these are the only people left now. So I'm going to put these ones in from here. If you ever need to take an instrument out of a kit, let's do that instead this time. So if you ever need to take an instrument out of a kit because you want to use it somewhere else, then you can also do that with this button here. Remove instrument from kit, and this one is change instrument if you needed to change an instrument to be something else. If you decided it's not a bass drum anymore, it's a tam-tam or a grand trommel or something else. So I've set this one up here. You might want to check your grid and how anything else is going to display if those are the options you're going to use. I'm going to be using a 5-line display for this one. So now I have percussion 1 and percussion 2. You see they're automatically doing the labelling for me for these two because they're the same type of instrument. And so now I have that one. Now again, it's showing me as a grid. So I want to go to layout options, and I want to tell my percussion that percussion 1 is a 5-line staff, and so is percussion 2 in the full score. So now I've got this set up. So on this 5-line staff, I've got triangle, snare drum, and bass drum. And if I go arrow up to the next one, I've got tam-tam, crash cymbal, and suspended cymbal. So that's a quick way then of setting those up for 2 5-line staves with those specific instruments in. But you will also want to check in your parts how you want these to display, because the percussion 1 and percussion 2 are defaulting to grids. So you might want to also in your layout options, if you want the same type of look, then you choose the percussion 1, percussion 2 that we've been using here, and you do the same in the player's percussion section. You might want to say that they're using a 5-line staff, a grid, or something else. It really depends how you want them to display. That's possibly the wrong percussion section. But you can choose which way around you want the layouts to be, because it might be that you want one to be in one style for the score to be as condensed as possible, and the other to be in the other style, if it's a little bit more visually clear. Now in this one you would probably also want to add some labels or something as to what's going on here, and one of the ways you can do that is in percussion and do a legend for all the instruments who are playing, and so that one would kind of show you here, but it may be that you want to do the labels in some other way as well. But the percussion legend, not as in a famous percussionist, but not that kind of legend, but a legend on the page to show you what's going on. So that might be the kind of thing you want to do. So you see, you can right click and say add a legend for all of the instruments, or just the people who are playing at the time, the instruments that are playing, if you wanted to use those. Now there's also, if you wanted to change any of the techniques that we've got, so let me just add in these ones as well. So you can see that my triangle bass drum and snare drum are using normal note heads. The cymbals are using these crash note heads, X note heads, sorry. And maybe you want to change some of those, or maybe you want to add other techniques as well. So let's have a look at how some of that works. So in setup mode, when you first started out, and I'm going to add one back in here so we can see what's going on. So let's put another suspended cymbal in here. It'll be called suspended cymbal 2 because it's changing the labeling automatically. And when you click on these little three dots here, you can then go to Edit Percussion Playing Techniques. So for this one suspended cymbal, it has one note head. So that's why it was always showing, and even when we used it down here, it's showing as an X note head down there. So that is the standard style. Now if you want to change it, then you can choose the note head set here, and there's all sorts of different note heads that you could possibly use, and you can also add your own note heads if you want to. So you can create different types of note heads if you wanted to. So diamonds are in here, and ornate X note heads and various other styles. Unset would just go back to the defaults, but this one was using the there's slashes in here as well. It was using one of the X ones. So there's a large X with diamonds, old style, ornate X, and various others. I'm just going to say X note heads. So that one is showing in here. If you have other types of techniques that you want to use, then you can also add them in here and choose different note heads for them. I'm just going to cancel this one. So let's say if we want to do it down here. So these instruments here, if I do this one, I said it's got Edit Percussion Playing Techniques. When I go to these green ones down here, this was the kit that we made of these three instruments. So if I choose this one here, I can't do Edit Percussion Playing Techniques because there's multiple instruments in here. So instead I go to Edit Percussion Kit, and this is where I was before when I set this instrument up and I imported them all into here. So now for all of these, let's do Tam Tam this time. So I can choose Tam Tam, and now I can do Edit Percussion Playing Techniques. So this is very similar to where I was a minute ago. It's just, I suppose, one step further in because it's part of a kit. So here is the natural note head in this case that the Tam Tam is using. And I can change the note head as I could before, but I can also, for any of these, I can add a new playing technique. So let's say for some reason there's a bell technique that you're going to be using on the Tam Tam. So you've got a natural one and you've got bell, and the bell wants to be a different type of note head, like let's say an ornate X, or actually let's say it's an old style diamond, sort of like, it's not really a bell anyway either. The middle of a no, never mind. So we've got this ornate diamond note head. So this one here is going to be a different technique to the natural. So now if I press OK, I can close this because I've finished editing my kit. Now when I'm using the Tam Tam here, I can also have Tam Tam Bell, which is a different type of note head. So when you're doing note input here, if I double click and use the arrows to go down, I've got Tam Tam, so I can enter a normal note on the Tam Tam. I'm just going to switch to galley view so that we're not moving the page around too much. There we go. And now, while I can press the arrow keys to move around, I can also press Alt or Option and the arrow keys, and I can move between the different techniques that the tam-tam has. So the arrow keys are moving to cymbals, Option or Alt, depends on the age of your computer and if it's a Mac or PC, be Option or Alt, and the arrow keys will change to the different technique. So I can now enter tam-tam bell. Now that's not necessarily going to sound like a tam-tam bell, because I've just made that up. I've picked a technique, the name of a technique, and I've picked a note head for it. I've told it where to exist on a 5-line staff, but it's not necessarily going to play back this sound versus a normal one. So, well, why is that? Well, that's because the sound might not exist. And if it does exist, it might not have been mapped. Some things will and some things won't. So we'll come back to how to make these play back, and we'll look at some of the other techniques that do play back. In fact, we can do that with the drum kit as well, actually, because the snare drum already has some different techniques, and we can look at how some of those things work, and then we'll refer back to this and how we might be able to make this play back. Because if you do have a different percussion library that has different techniques, then you might want to map those and get them to play back. So we'll look at that. But just for visually changing the look, you can do that, and you can move the notes, of course, between any of the instruments, but you can also switch those if you need to be a different technique. And for editing these, I'm just pressing Option Shift and the arrows to change an existing note into a different, there's a different length, into a different technique for that instrument. So you can define all sorts of different note heads and all sorts of you might, of course, need more of a grid or some visual way of showing people what's going on here, more labels or something else. Maybe you have a legend at the beginning that tells people what the note heads mean for each instrument. Whether you're having them as a single line staff or not doesn't matter for these playing techniques and the different types of note heads. That doesn't matter at all. They're just different ways of displaying the same kind of things. So a quick question about the plus button in the lowest edit playing techniques. I think you mean this one. And this is if you're adding techniques into here, which would be combined techniques. So this is sometimes used if rolls need to be triggered in a particular way, or if you've got an articulation like marcato that wants to be triggered. So you're using the natural note head here, but if the marcato technique with this symbol on it, when you add that to the score, if that's going to trigger something differently in playback, then that's where you'd add it. So each technique here, and you could have multiple techniques if you needed them, but each technique here could have an extra playback option here, and what that does. And if that was the case, then you probably also change the playback technique to match as well, because you can trigger different playback techniques with them. It's not commonly used in many libraries because most libraries don't have a different key switch, for example, to trigger those different techniques. They're often normally done more by velocity and things like that. But if you needed to, then that's what this section is here in this little plus button, if you needed it. Now, I think what we'll do... Oh, actually, let me just check. So if you're doing things... We've got our 3 instruments. Oops, we went to page view, and we've got our glockenspiel. We didn't bother labeling that on mallets, but we could have done. So, of course, this would apply the same way, that if you're writing notes for your glockenspiel, oops, I've got my MIDI keyboard in the wrong octave. If you're writing notes for glockenspiel here, and then you're writing notes for xylophone here, and then chimes later on, then the same will happen when you go to page view. So it doesn't matter whether they are pitched or unpitched. You'll get the same labels, options, and that kind of thing, because we've done them all as a combined player, and that's how we've told them to display. I suppose if you do write things for more than one instrument at the same time, so if they were playing something here on the chimes at the same time as glockenspiel, then when you're in page view, then Dorico is going to be showing you more than one at that point. And the same if we go to the mallets part here, then it's just going to show you more staves at that point. Even though you've allowed instrument changes for that system, it's not possible because of the way you've added these instruments and sounds. So it's going to show them as multiples. Maybe you want to put some staff labels on at that point. You know, whether it's at the beginning or partway through, you might want to do that. There is also a little, if you ever need it, often partway through, if you need to just override what the staff labels are doing. So let's see if we can do it. Actually, we'll do it partway through. So we'll say some bars in, they and they are all playing, oops, wrong octave again, the same thing. So let's say we only wanted to show some staff labels here. If you know that's exactly where they're going to be, so don't do this partway through a project, but at the end when you're just finishing the layout of this and you've decided this is what's going to happen. So let's just say, we'll delete that one. Let's say this is what's going to happen. Normally we're doing this, then for some reason we've needed to display all three of them at the same time. So at that point, if you go to engrave mode and you add a system break, which is Shift S, or you can do create system break here. I turned my signposts off earlier, of course, so I won't be seeing them, but if you go to the view menu, signposts, you can turn them on again so you can see your system break signpost. When you can see your system break signpost and select it from the properties panel down here, then one of the options for a system break is that you can choose the staff labels, and you can choose which staff labels you want at this point. So maybe you just want abbreviated ones. So if there was a case where most of the time you were doing this, let me turn these off again, you were doing this and it was doing the instrument changes for you, and then at one point you needed to show more instruments, then add a little system break, choose that system break, and then you can turn the staff labels on at that point. But like I said, don't do it partway through the project because maybe that system break will move or affect some of the other spacing. So only do it at the end if you needed to, and you needed to add that little label. Now I'm going to move on for a second. I think, yes, because some of the sounds bits will also come back to those. So I'm going to move on for a second to drum kits. Let's do this in a new little project. So I'll say new. Now the default drum kit in Dorico, in fact we'll start as we did before, so single player, and when you type drum then you get drum set basic and drum set full. Basic's fine for what we're going to be showing, full has more instruments in it. So this is the basic drum kit. It's a green instrument already, so this is already, as you'd expect from the name, a kit. So I'm just going to double click here, I'm going to just add 4/4 and I'm going to press Shift B and I'm going to add 23 bars. So I've got some bars. So now, for my drum kit, I've got all the individual bits of the kit. So let's have a look at how this is already made up. So in setup mode, for my drum kit, if you go to Edit Percussion Kit, I have these items already in the kit. So this is the standard kit. The full kit just has more options, more toms and that kind of thing. So all of the items here, you can see where they're going to sit, and also you can see the stem direction for some of these. So the ride cymbals and the hi-hats, for example, are stems up. The snare drum here, this one stems down. The kick drum stems down, and you can change these. So if you want everything that's hands to be stems up, you can change it, and feet to be stems down if you so wish. So you can just change the stem direction in here. So this is the setup for the 5-line staff. There's also a setup for the grid, and there's a setup for the single line instruments. So while you probably don't want it most of the time, there is the option for a standard drum kit in the layout options in Players Percussion to show as a drum grid. So this is the drum kit separated out as a grid, or as single line instruments. And I'll say there is occasionally a use for single line instruments, because if you only wanted to select all the tom notes and do something with them, or I don't know, all of the snare drum notes in a couple of bars, then this is a very quick way of doing it, because you can change them in here and just switch back to layout options and then go back to a 5-line grid when you've done that little whatever it is you need to do. So you've got your drum set in here. So when you're inputting notes for your drum kit, you can do the same as I was for doing the drums earlier. So you can move up and down this way, and you can say, for example, Y when I'm on that note, and you can press Y when I'm on this one. It is, however, quicker if you're using your QWERTY keyboard. So you're using this one, then you can just press F and C, because that will give you, imagine this is a treble clef, that will give you the bass on F and the snare on C for those two instruments. And then, but it is also even quicker when you're inputting notes. Let's go carry on actually from where we were. So over here, if you have a MIDI keyboard, I'm just going to put mine in the right octave. Then 2 octaves for low, middle, C. Oh, I've just fallen off the edge of my camera. So that one is your bass drum, and then D is your snare drum. So you can do it this way. And you also then have things like toms are in here as well on a couple of these notes. So I'm pressing A and G. And then if I just go back to the beginning, so I'm just going to press Command and back to go back a few bars, you can then choose the note value, for example, 8th notes, and press F sharp for hi-hats. And if you press B flat, then you get open hi-hats. So that's the quickest way, and you've got things like crash cymbal over here as well. So that's going to be a faster way if using a MIDI keyboard. Now, how does that layout work? How do all of these things actually pan out? How do I know that? Well, it's a fairly standard way of playing drums on a keyboard, so that you can actually play them effectively, sort of live if you want to. And you can, if you want to, and you know what you're doing, then you can press this record button for the drum kit, and you can play in your kit if you're a MIDI drummer, or as they say, a keyboard drummer, and know where those are. But the way that works is it's using the percussion map. So we had a quick look earlier in Dorico preferences. In the note input and editing section, if you scroll down a bit, it said when you're inputting into a kit, which we are, use the percussion map. If you do use staff position, I'll show you this is also an example. This would be preferred by some people, I'm sure. Then when I'm inputting notes here, on my MIDI keyboard, I now can press F. I'm in the wrong octave. See, if you get in the right octave, you can press F and C, and you can think of it like a treble clef, and you can enter notes that way. But I'm not doing it that way. I'm using the option of use percussion map. The preferences switch over. So now when I'm inputting notes, I'm changing down. I've got a little octave control option here, and now I'm pressing these two notes to input notes in the same way, because it also gives me options like open hi-hats that I wouldn't have with the other method. Now there is an open option over here in the playing techniques in unpitched percussion. There are open techniques. There's one here, and that one's actually called Open 2. And the reason it's called Open 2 is that this one is open, which is for different types of instruments, because that's the harmonic one. But the different types of instruments, open means something different, and hi-hats is a particular one. So you can use that one if you want to as a graphic, but it's a little bit slow to use that one. So I find it's quicker to use a MIDI keyboard. You can, of course, also use down here. We now have the drum kit down here as well. So if you want to just use this one, you don't have a MIDI keyboard, or you're thinking, I couldn't possibly learn how that works. Fair enough. You also have down here all of the items of your drum kit here. So you can enter notes from here as well if you want to. So again, you just turn the caret on as you had them before. You can press a snare drum. There's a side stick, cross stick, rim shot. And it's bringing the different note heads for me for the different styles. There's a kick drum down here. There's ride cymbals and everything else down here. And the stem directions and the rests are being sorted accordingly. Now this, of course, is a mess, so we'll tidy some things up in a second. But for note input, you can use these. And if these are in a random order for you and you want to sort them, then you can press this little button here, and you can then move these and sort them into an order that you prefer. So if you would like, for example, we've got a crash cymbal over here, and we've got hi-hats and snares, and I'd like kick drum in the bottom left corner, for example. Then maybe I want to put the snare next. Maybe I want the other snare techniques with it. So you can drag these around, sort them however you want them. Maybe I want hi-hats up there, that kind of thing, so that you then put them in an order you want them to be in, so that you can find things more easily however you would like to find them. You can also use the key editor. So in the key editor here, if I expand this, so this is what we saw earlier when we had different instruments, but we not only have different instruments, crash cymbal, hi-hat, we also have different techniques for them. So when I choose a note here, you can see that that one's the open to technique, and that's the hi-hat, which would be the closed technique. And for the snare, we've got the side stick snare here, we've got a rim shot here, there's a kick drum note here. So you can see all of these. So if you needed to change these and you can't remember the shortcuts for all of these, you can also just drag them in here and it will change the note height for you, because they will all match accordingly to these techniques down here. So like I said, you don't have to remember the shortcuts for those if that's an easier way for you to do it. Now if you want to add extra techniques, so this is what we started to look at for the tam-tam. So in setup mode, let's look at one that's already set up. So I'm going to go to Edit Percussion Kit, and here's the snare drum. So it shows me the stem directions. If you want to be stems up, change them there. If you edit the percussion playing techniques, then this says that the snare drum has a natural technique, a rim shot technique, a cross stick, and a side stick technique. And they have different types of note heads, and you can change the different types of note heads for each of those techniques. If you wanted to add a new technique, then you could do the same as we did before. You could press the plus button, you could add a different note head to it. It would then show up here. It would also show up, of course, it's for you to use on the staff, and it would show up in the key editor at the bottom. But we were also talking about how playback would work and whether or not those things would work or not. And that also, with the note input, is tied in with percussion maps. So I'm just going to have a look at percussion maps. Now, in most cases, you probably won't really need to edit percussion maps, but sometimes knowing that they exist is also useful. So in the menu here, in the library menu, there's percussion maps. So if you choose that option, it will show you the percussion maps that exist on your system. I'd say actually now in Dorico 5, possibly a slightly easier way to make sure you're using the right one is to go to the play menu, because in here, when I've got this instrument chosen here in my track inspector, it tells me where it's playing, which is Groove Agent, and we will look at Groove Agent in a minute, and it also tells me the percussion map that's being used, which is the Groove Agent SE Studio. So I'm going to click this little button here, which will edit and choose the correct percussion map for the instrument I'm using. So here are all the techniques. Now this is initially a slightly confusing list, I'll admit. But for example, you can see here that on this MIDI note, which can be called MIDI note 36 or C1, there is a bass drum, which is the label for it. It's on the instrument kick drum low, and the technique is natural. So when we were looking at the snare drum earlier, you see there's a snare drum listed here. Here's a side stick. Here is an acoustic snare option. Here is the rim shot that we were looking at earlier. So the different techniques for the snare drum may be listed on different notes, and they can have different playback techniques. Now these playback techniques, side stick and rim shot, mapped with the instrument, is exactly what we had in setup mode. So just for a second, we'll go back to setup mode. We will edit the percussion kit and the snare drum for the playing techniques. So when you were deciding which ones of these you were using, so let's say, for example, you wanted a jazz kit, a brush kit. If your library supports it, and I know, for example, NotePerformer does support it, you can choose the, in fact, let's do this, and then I'll come back to our drum kit in a minute. I'm going to change the playback template to NotePerformer. You might not have NotePerformer, but it's an example, and I know somebody asked recently. So I'm going to go to NotePerformer. What this is going to do, by choosing the NotePerformer playback template, any of the instruments I had, in this case it's only the drum kit, it's going to load them all with NotePerformer instead. Now, there's a downside with NotePerformer, which is that you can't use our live stage and those kind of things, but lots of the things are pre-mapped for you. So it's using a percussion map here, and it has its own setup for the percussion map. In fact, let me just check. Is side stick, yeah, open, yeah, bell, rim shot. Now, they have a stir technique. So if you're using that kind of jazz brush stir sound, they have called the technique stir. It's actually, in their language, called swirl, but the technique in Dorico is stir, and that's going to be the important bit, is this one here for the snare drum. So let's say we want to use that technique. In setup mode, for our standard kit here, the snare drum does not have stir. So we need to add a technique of stir. Actually, I'll give you a hint. I start typing in here and it will give you some options so you can find the right one. It's a little bit quicker. Press OK. So now I've got a stir technique. You will give it a note head. I actually don't know what note head we use for this. I'm going to use a moon. There we go. So stir is now a moon head note head. So I can now write for. So I've got the rim shot here. There's now a stir technique, so I can also do it down here if I want to. So I can add in a stir, and it is a moon note head. Slightly odd, but there you go. So that will be our. This isn't ideal, but it's a stir note head. Now I'd also need to, in NotePerformer's case, I also have to press this little E, and I have to tell it that it's not using the sticks kit, that it's also using the brushes kit. But now that I have a stir technique in setup mode, mapping this note head, and in their percussion map, they already have a stir technique which maps on the snare drum to this particular MIDI note, it means that that will now be okay, that one will now be the stir technique. Actually, the playback's quite low, isn't it? Sorry about that. But if you want to try it out on your system, then you can map it. Now that's because you're mapping something that already exists in their library to the particular playing technique in Dorico and a particular note head. And they all need to map up. So basically the techniques that you set up in setup mode, they need to be able to map in the percussion map. When you're in that percussion map, it is also important, for example with floor toms, that you're mapping exactly the right instrument. So there are marching snares and there are snare drums. Don't map the wrong one or it won't add up. When you're doing floor toms, there are multiple different types of floor toms, and you need to make sure you're mapping the right technique on the right floor tom to the right MIDI note, because otherwise if you're using floor tom medium and it's looking for low, then it's not going to work. See, this one is tom-tom medium low, this one is tom-tom medium, so you need to be very exact with which ones, and that's why, for example, you can have different crash cymbals. In this case, NotePerformer maps them both to the same note, so it makes no difference which one you use. But if you wanted to, in some libraries, you could do that. Now I'm just going to switch this back to our default playback template. So I'm going to use this one. And the GASE bit is Groove Agent, which is our drum module. So this is going to unload NotePerformer. It's going to load Groove Agent. And when I get a little green, there we go, little green play button, it's now mapped. So this one has a bunch of different techniques mapped for our studio kit. So when I click on the little E, then I can see our drum kit. So if I just move this over here for a second. So now I'm going to choose write mode. So these notes here are mapping to the drum kit, again using the individual percussion map. So all of the notes here, as they play back when you press play or when you click on a note, they're auditioning and lighting up the little pads over here and the drum kit over here. You can also play this one over here if you want to, some hand claps, some cymbals and various other things, the tambourine. So you can play them in here as well and visually see what's going on with all of the notes in here. So if there are other techniques, for example, that exist, and there are in some of these kits, there are other techniques. These little groups of buttons here let you change things. So there's hi-hat shank open, there's a ride bow, which I think is already mapped. Claps might not be necessarily in various kits. The toms probably are. There's some different kind of how far open the hi-hat is. You can map some of those if you want to. There's, of course, cowbell, tip and shoulder, if you need more cowbell. And various other options in here. So a lot of them are mapped in the percussion map, but they aren't necessarily mapped for the kit. So if you want to, you can map extras of those techniques if you want to. You can decide if you want them to be on the same note head or something else. I commonly use the hi-hats all with the same look, but maybe a slightly different sound as the groove progresses to get different, hi-hat open sounds with these hi-hat shank open 1, open 2, open 3 buttons. So you can use those if you need to. Now, the other neat thing you can do with Groove Agent is that Groove Agent also comes with some patterns. So here we've got some patterns of things that are playing. I've just realised my ears are turned down a little bit, sorry. I don't know if that might be slightly distorting, apologies if that is. But the idea is that if you need some of these patterns, then you can grab these pads and you can drag them into Dorico, and Dorico will notate that pattern for you. Now what this is doing is this is a little MIDI button, if you like, a little MIDI region of some MIDI notes. And when you drag and drop MIDI into Dorico in the key editor, it imports it as MIDI, and it uses the percussion map, which is important. So anything that's in this, which exists in the percussion map, will then automatically get mapped onto the staff here for the drum kit. So that's one way that you can then get some notation this way if you want it. Now, if you don't want to be displaying all of this, for one or more bars, so I've clicked on this bar, I hold down Shift and click on this bar. If I press Shift R and type slash, then I can just display it as slashes. But this is bar 11 and 12, and you can see all the notes are still here. So if I just press play, all of these will still play, even though I'm just showing the slashes. So that can be a potential useful playback option, because slashes on any instrument will hide all of the notes that are behind them. So you can still get the playback if you need it, but show your drummer just the slashes. I've just pressed delete to delete those again. I'm going to show you another option. So I'm going to delete all of these notes. Maybe I don't actually need any of these notes in here, but I do want to trigger one of these patterns. So let's say maybe this one over here is this G. Now you see, hopefully you can just see on this pad, they've all got little labels, F sharp 0, G 0, D sharp 0. So you can trigger those with a MIDI note if you want to. So if I choose this staff here, there's an option in Dorico for MIDI trigger regions. So I'm going to select a couple of bars. I'm going to press Shift 0 for MIDI trigger regions, and I'm going to type in G0, because G0 is what's listed on this pad here. So if I type that and press enter, then I get this little region at the bottom here which says G0. Unfortunately you can't see it when it's selected, but it does when it's not selected. So now when I play this, it's going to play that one. If I wanted this one, so that's a fill on B0. So now if I choose this one and say B0, then I can trigger that little MIDI region. So now I'll play G0 for 2 bars and then B0. So you can use those if you don't actually need any notation. So in all of these, you can just write slash. Slash regions can be extended with the mouse or with shortcuts. They will automatically number themselves, and you can turn those off if you don't want them. So you don't actually have to write any notation. You can, for a lot of these cases, you can write the slashes that you need. You can have Dorico trigger it, which means if you export the audio from this as an MP3 file, for example, you will actually get that correct sound if you need it. But you haven't actually had to worry about any of the notation and then hide it or anything else. You can just trigger the MIDI region if that was useful. There was one other thing that just escaped me. Maybe it's in the comments. Bear with me a second. How do you do a half-open hi-hat to a specific sound? So you would work out what you want that to display as, which I think you'd probably use, for example, one of these half-open options here. And you see it says half-open, pt.half-open. So you would add that to the score, and you would make sure in your percussion map, so in library percussion maps, you would make sure that you find whichever MIDI note you need it to be, and you would map that to the hi-hat and half open. So instead of shaft open or something, whichever note it is, you'd map it to that one, and that's how you do it. So you need to make sure you're in the correct instrument, hi-hat, and shaft open. If you needed to add another one in here, for example, let's say you wanted to use this one as your half open sound, if it's the correct one, then all of the notes are in use here. But if you do key switch alternative, you can add a second line which is exactly the same. So MIDI note 34, still B flat 0. This is a copy, it's still hi-hat, and this is stick shaft open. So if you wanted half open, you can change it down here, and you can say half open. Excuse me. Choose half open, or not the stick shaft open. I'm just going to unchoose that one so I don't get both, because otherwise it needs both techniques. Press OK. So I've got half open, press apply, so I've got half open and stick shaft open are both going to the same key. So if you needed to map a particular technique, you can do it that way. That wasn't what I was going to say. Patterns, importing, we've triggered them. I know what it was. It was with slash regions. So regardless of whether you're using these slashes, with playback or without. So let's say when there's no playback for these, but the important thing is notationally at this point, we want to show the drummer what's going on with the slashes of what they need to play, but also some cues of another instrument that's playing. So we need to do some rhythmic cues across the top for the brass players or the bass player or whatever. They need to know what other rhythms people are playing as cue notes across the top. The easiest way to do this is you are likely in setup mode, and if not, you can add one. Add another instrument. You are likely to already have another instrument. Oh, I've just noticed this is still being in orchestral order. I'll just drag these because I like the drummer to be at the bottom. So, at the same point, your trumpet player probably is already playing. So let's just put some... Oh, no, not down there. Wrong octave again. It doesn't matter what the notes are. He is already playing something, and you want the drummer to know what the hits are that they're playing. Maybe they've got accents on, and all the other stuff that you've previously done doesn't matter. But this is the information that you want to tell the drummer across the top. So to be honest, it's fairly quick to put them in there anyway. Now, if I choose the drum part down here, and I use the cues option, so it's this little ear symbol over here, but I can also just press Shift U. I can say that I want to cue the trumpet. In the score, I would just get trumpet B flat as a label, and when I go to the part, it will show me here the cues that the trumpet is then playing. Now, you get an option as a global option in engraving options, or you can also choose it down here in the preferences for this cue as to which ones you want. So do you want, for example, if you don't care about the slurs because they look like ties, then you can turn those off. Do you care about the articulations and ornaments or not? Do you want a rhythmic cue? If you don't, it tends to sit in the staff, so you probably do, but maybe you want to use rhythmic slashes for those. You get the option, you can just turn them on. Now, the really useful thing about this is that if the trumpet part changes in the score or the part, it doesn't matter. So let's say that note actually was there instead. Then also your drum kit part will automatically change, so you don't need to worry about things that change later. The drummer actually will still be as up to date as everybody else is. You can change these little labels, so if you don't want that to say trumpet, then you can change it to say brass if they're just following a brass cue or a bass cue or whatever it is they want. But that's a very fast way of doing it. You can change how far off the staff they are, and they will just sit over the top of these slashes if you need them. I think I've missed a question in there. No, I'm not sure. Maybe I didn't miss the question. I think Daniel's answering some of those ones anyway. There was so cues on top of slashes. Now you can do slashes and notes in the same bar. We talked about these rests and extra rests that we've got. You can remove those just by going to Edit Remove Rests if you don't want them. But there are also other things with drum kits that you might want to do. So for example, even these rhythms at the top here, if you go into Library Notation Options and then look in the percussion section, you can say things like, do you want to use ties or not? You might find when you import MIDI files that you might get lots of ties because of the way that they were played in, or if you've played them in live, and you can just opt for Dorico to remove the ties automatically, so it will truncate all of the notes automatically to the shortest duration. You can also just say, actually, you know what, I don't care about the voices, I don't care about stems up and stems down, you put them all in the same single voice, please. So you can do that. There's also options to do with what to do with rests and whether you want to pad voices with rests or not. And those kind of things. So there's various options for things that you might want to choose for your own presets, and press apply. So in this bar here, for example, now I've now got everything all in the same voice. Maybe that's in some cases a useful option that you want to use. You can also individually still flip notes with F. So if for some reason there's one particular note you want to change and flip, you can. There are slash voices you can use. So if you don't want an entire slash region, you can use slash voices. There's a link in the description to a drums in 1 minute video, which takes 48 minutes. But that's because I've explained everything and then shown you in 1 minute how you can write a quick drum part. So really there is a point to the drums in 1 minute, but there's a lot more about the intricacies of doing this kind of notation and various bars and things, and how you use those and voices and stem directions and slash regions in that specific video if you want some of those as well. One last thing I just thought of is if you've written a couple of bars, I'm just going to delete some notes. If you've written a couple of bars, in fact, you can even show you this in the score as well, it doesn't matter. And you want them to be the next two bars to be the same. When you do Shift R and just do %2, then it will give you a 2-bar repeat, which will also play back. So this bit will play back. So you get the same 2-bar playback. If you don't want 2 bars, then you can just do 1 bar. So if you just do %, then in the Shift R popover, then you can do that. You can drag those the same with various other regions. So now it tells you how many bars it's playing that bar again for the 3rd time. There's 4-bar repeats, there's 2-bar repeats, those kind of things, and they all play back. So you don't need to hide things behind to get the playback to work. You don't even need to use MIDI trigger regions to make those work either. Drum cues in the score. Yes, sorry. So here we weren't showing the cue because commonly, I suppose in orchestral terms, they don't. In your layout options, so library menu, layout options, or Command Shift L, in here for the players, for cues, you can say show cues. So I'm in the players section, cues, show cues. So I'm on the full score layout. You'll see that for apply changes. You see this one here, the trumpet part is already showing it, but the full score wasn't. So now I've also got those in the score. Is there a request for can request features and updates? Yes, I'd use the forum. If you go to dorico.com/forum, Ghost Note, there's something you requested for Ghost Notes. There it is. One Ghost Note. Can I place multiple notes within the same parentheses? Probably. Email me, Terry. Let's have a look. Discover Dorico. Oh no. Daniel says we've heard this one before. So we're talking to the right person. Okay. If you do need things, you can also email me. So discoverdorico@steinberg.de. I can tell you what's possible today, and if a workaround is necessary to do something, then I can probably tell you that. If it's a feature request of something that doesn't exist, then the Dorico forum is a good place to do that. So dorico.com/forum, because I can't create things for you. Let me just see if there's any other questions that were in there. Anything I've missed? I think a lot of them have been asked. I'll just say, in case there's something else entirely different that you want to map, a completely different orchestral instrument and sound, if it's already been done by somebody, then the forum is a good place to ask. But also, if you go to our resources page, so dorico.com/resources, there's a link in there to playback templates. So if it's an orchestral something in the BBCSO Spitfire library, or Spitfire have done a new library for something, then it might be that either we've done a playback template, or on the forum somebody started a playback template for that. What you may find people will do is in play mode here, don't just change the options that's here. So when you're in your VST rack, don't go, oh, I'll just change these options here, because other instruments are probably already using them. But what you can do is add a new one. So let's say, for example, you wanted a drum kit from Kontakt. You can go to Native Instruments and you can add a Kontakt 7, a Kontakt 8, whatever you have installed. And you can then add into there, hang on a second, here we go, here's Kontakt. So you could choose something else, maybe from Action Strikes Hits, because that was the first one that was listed. Big Cinematic Hits. I've not actually used this one. Now all of these are, particular hits of things. If you wanted to map Dorico to use some of these, now it's here in Kontakt, then in play mode, you can choose whichever instrument, so maybe it's one bit of a drum kit. It's more likely to be an individual percussion instrument, but let's just say for the sake of argument it's the kick drum. You can now say in the track inspector that the kick drum would use that new thing that you've added. You will need a percussion map or need to create a percussion map to get things to trigger correctly. So at this point, you would need to go to, well, if you click this button, it won't load the right map, so you'll need to find one. You'll need to add a new percussion map. You can import one if you want to, if you've already got something. If you've got something Cubase, for example, but you may need to start your own percussion map, because to get the playback to be correct from what Dorico is playing back, even for a natural note, or that's our default is natural when we don't specify a technique, you'll need a percussion map in here so that things are mapped through correctly. So you can map it to Kontakt on a particular MIDI channel. I would press the little cog and give it a name of Action Hits or something so that you don't go insane and wonder what it is later. But also you're going to need a percussion map to make sure that that works and maps correctly. So if you're starting to set anything else up manually, that's what you'd need to do. Somebody previously asked about congas and bongos. There aren't that many sounds in our default set for them, but also I can't find a single agreed mapping of people between Noteheads and styles and what they would like. If there is one, then please tell me or somebody on the team. But also I can't even find a name to kind of describe, this is the Jeff layout, this is the whatever layout. Well, I know Brazilian style, or I know Latin style, or whatever, even those. So if there are some agreed ones, then maybe we can help map some of those. But that's the kind of thing you'd also need to do. You've got your VST instrument and you need to map all of the individual notes in a percussion map, and you can then map those in setup mode to the techniques and note heads and staff positions that you want in Dorico. It's all possible, it's all there, but it does get a little confusing the first time you do it. And as I said at the very beginning, I think if you're looking to do things with marching drumline, so the US style, and if you're using things like VDL, which is another library, then Eric Cruz has a template that will already map a lot of this for you. You can buy a template for him with it all pre-mapped, and you can just get on and start writing. So if you need that, get in touch again. We can put you in touch with him. Let me just see if there's any other question. Stemless notes for a drum legend? Which drum legend are you working with? No, I know, I should stop making that joke. So if you choose a note and you are in here in the properties panel, there's all sorts of properties for things, including, actually, it's not the one we wanted, but LV ties are in here as well if you need something to ring on. But in engrave mode for a particular note, when you look over here, there's hide stem and there's hide note head. So if you need to turn a stem off, then you can do that. For one or more selected notes, you can hide stems and or hide note heads. In Groove Agent, what's the dial on the right hand side? Here's my other little trick, by the way. When you select an instrument here, you can set in the preferences, so in Dorico preferences or edit preferences, in the key commands, you can set yourself a shortcut so that when you have a staff selected and you hit your own little shortcut, ta-da, your little pop-up appears for the instrument that you wanted. So if I do this one, ta-da, then, Groove Agent appeared there, and Hallion Sonic appeared on my other monitor. There you go, to prove it did show up. So you can have that and have a little shortcut for your pop-up window. This dial here is kind of graphically showing you what's going on in this style, which is unfortunately a country style. So it's showing you which button you clicked on and what's going on. But there's also other things you can change. So the ride, are they allowed to use the bell? Is the autofill on or off? There's the half-time on or off, is the auto complexity on or off, and you can use this dial to kind of choose things as well if you want to, which is very similar to using these buttons. It's just another way of using the interface. There's also options over here for some of the MIDI details, some of the quantizing. And there is also a bigger version of Groove Agent with even more options in it, if that kind of thing is what you would need. A single line staff for rhythmic effects like foot stomps. If you have a look at a Discover session I did on the Jacob Collier Choir, there are foot stomps in that one. I specifically mapped in Kontakt the foot stomps and that kind of thing for that one. But basically you do the same. You would have a single line instrument. Now if you can't find a single line instrument that you want, you can also use the library manager, and there's an instruments section here. In the edit instruments, you can add in your own instruments into here. You can choose how many staff lines, so single line, and you could make a foot stomps something in here if you needed to. And then I think I've deleted mine now. I've got finger snaps is still here. Yes, I added finger snaps, but let me see. Did I add? I should use the search at the top. I might still. Oh, just type it in here. It will filter for me, won't it? Stomp. I did add a stomp, so I've got a foot stomp, and it's a single line staff. So that was how you visually set it up. Stomp now exists. When I go to create a new instrument, I can just go add a new player, stomp, or add a new instrument, stomp, and I can add that instrument. And then I also set that up for playback with the Jacob Collier Choir, because there's foot stomps, hand claps, finger clicks, something else. I think there's a visual something as well. That they've done with that interface. So have a look in that, because there's a lot more details in there. But any instrument that doesn't already exist in Dorico, in the Library Instruments Manager, you can create it in here. That's only creating the visual look, the stem directions if necessary, the clefs, the number of staff lines, the range, all of those kind of things. If you want them to play back, then you also need to attach it in play mode, and initially you'll need to do that manually through to Kontakt or anything else. Once you've done it once, you can save all of the setup that you've done here. So for example, this Kontakt item here, you can save this in the little cog. It's called an endpoint setup. You can save the endpoint configuration. You can add it to your own playback template. I think that's another session entirely. There is a session already on creating and sharing playback templates. It's also on our channel with a lot of the details into that one. Maybe I need to redo some of that session because I think it's a couple of years old now. But yes, creating and sharing playback templates is how you could then make all the playback work, not only for the one project you're working on now, but in the future, so that you can just automatically, in the future, pick that new instrument you've created, and Dorico will automatically load the sound that you want to use for it on your computer. Foot stomps between the grand staff for piano and harp. That would probably be trickier, I think, to do that one. On the percussion part, is there a way to list all the instruments played by that player? The legend would do that. Sorry, the questions just moved then. So the drum legend that we had, actually there was one other thing I was going to show you on that layout while I think about it. So when we were doing these earlier, and I just right click on the staff and I chose percussion legend, and that showed me all of the instruments that they were playing. The other thing that occurred to me in here is that because it's using our default playback options, when it's set up all of these instruments, it's not only set them up in the mixer here so that you've got a fader for all of these instruments, but it means that when you go to here for the live stage, you could also got these instruments here in the live stage, so you can move them around to be wherever they want to be. So the chimes, for example, can have less reverb or more reverb. It can be panned left or right depending on where you want to them. Now the live stage and the amount of reverb, also these options don't work if you're using NotePerformer, because they do them all themselves, but they do work in here so that you can move those people around in the live stage should you need to. Writing rolls in the instruments, that's a good point. We didn't really cover rolls. So let's say one of these symbols, here's one. So for this instrument here, They exist because they're repeated notes. They exist in this repeat section, repeat structures here, and they're tremolos often when they're used. You can use these buttons, so you can do things like a 3-stroke roll if you want to. You may also want one of these options at the bottom here, which is tremolo with release and tremolo with attack. So you might want that one where you don't want the slashes to be on the last one. On the last note of the tie chain. You can also, when you select a note, you can use Shift R and you can type 0 if you want to remove one. You can type Shift R and 3 if you want 3 rolls. And you can type Shift R and you can type 3 rel for release if you only want them to be here but not here. The other one is 3 ATT, I think 3 attack, which only shows them at the end but not at the beginning. Probably not in this case. It's probably a 3 rel. So you can use the Shift R popover, and because they're repeats, which is in repeat structures, they also exist on these options over here for tremolos as well. Daniel, let me know if there's any questions I've missed of anything that was useful to show. There's a lot of questions in here, so I think I'm going to have to maybe go back and check some of these comments later. In fact, it's only showing me some of the comments as well, not all of them, which is annoying in the live chat. Let me just adjust that. I think there's... It looks like Daniel has probably answered most of these, I think, now. We've looked at, yes, so mapping and creating your own percussion maps if you need them. I would ask if there's somebody else who's already done one. If you ask on our forum or the Facebook group, there's often somebody who's already done one. So I know somebody was looking at Easy Drummer the other day. There was already a mapping somebody done for those. So, you know, don't reinvent the wheel if you don't need to. Does Groove Agent have brushes? That's a good question. So when we were using Groove Agent, it was the other project that was open, wasn't it? Yes, didn't have the kit in here. So in Groove Agent, in the kit, what you'll need to do, here's Groove Agent. It's loaded one kit by default. If you choose the name here, where it says load kit, or the little drop down, and choose the options, go to Jazz Essentials, because Jazz Essentials has a bunch of jazz kits, and I think Swing Seat is one of the ones that then has brushes in it. So if you just double click on Swing Seat, then it will load that into here, and now you have that one. Some of them do. I can't remember which ones do, but some of these do if you need them. So yes, you can load brush kits into there if you need to. Excuse me, apologies. Yes, so drum instruments with brushes. There's too many questions. I think most of these have been mapped already. Somebody asked about the tempo. The initial tempo in Dorico does match with Groove Agent, but unfortunately at the moment, if there are tempo changes in the project, then Groove Agent doesn't map with those. But there is also, for all of these buttons, there's a sync to beat, and if you want to trigger it kind of partway through a beat, partway through a riff, then you might need to choose one or more of these pads and turn off the sync to beat. You see it's on for each individual one, so you'd need to choose whichever pattern. You might want to turn off the sync to beat if you're not triggering it at the beginning of that. I think most of the other questions have been answered, so apologies if not. As always, you can get in touch with us if you need to after this. You can write comments in here, but actually it's often better to write us comments either on Facebook or the forum. So there's a dedicated Facebook group, so facebook.com/groups/Dorico. You can also go to the forum, which is just dorico.com/forum. I'll put these links in the description in a second. And also, of course, you can email me. So if you need to email me specifically with something, if you've got a project that's got, a problem or a specific question, a specific setup, email discoverdorico@steinberg.de. I do get a fair number of emails on there, but I will get back to you, so bear with me. So I think on kind of an overview of drums and percussion and various options, that's probably a fair amount of information and probably enough for today. There's all sorts of things we could potentially look at still with, playback options and various things. So if you've got a particular setup that you want to be able to do, maybe that would also be useful as another session. So please let us know on that front. There is another session, one of these sessions coming up this month, which I've just forgotten what the topic is. Does anybody remember what the topic is? I'm just going to look it up now. It's on the 23rd of October. I know that bit. It will be on vocal and choral music. So if you have examples of things that you want to be able to achieve with lyrics or with vocal and choral music, then let me know. And that's to be the next live session we do at the same time on Wednesday, the 23rd of October. So thank you for joining us live. Keep the questions coming if you want. In the chat will be running just for a little while once the session finishes. And then, yes, please join us for the next one. So thank you very much. Bye.